It's a really good topic for today. It's going to weave a lot of the things we were talking about this morning with Dan's presentation and all that variability in different things and the ups and downs and swings of the insect population. A lot of the stuff that Ken covered on innovators and a lot of things that Lewis is going to talk about after me as well. So really looking forward to this opportunity. Really slow here. What's going on? Am I still on the first slide? Or are we... Well, where am I supposed to? I'm probably pressing at the wrong spot here. Okay, so I got to acknowledge a couple people before we get started. Tarantino, let's start with the credits here. Jan Slasky at Initech Alberta, had some great conversations with him on kind of the overall hemp industry and kind of where things are going, and got some really good slides from him. Scott Chalmers is the research director at WADA, which is out in Manitoba. They're kind of a similar organization to us. They do a lot of work with farmers, with novel croppings in their diversification center. Liam O'Halloran, he's a lead, I guess, agronomy person on the Norquin, the quinoa team. So he's really lots of help in the novel crop space there. Obviously, Ken helped me kind of organize and put my thoughts together. I should probably mention Lewis as well. And then I guess I'll put Carlo down here because he put me, but some of these slides go back to before his time. He was probably still back in grade school from some of these research projects where I'm digging through the archives here. So the funders, again, AOF, WGRF, CAP, ARDAR, some of these crop commissions and industry commissions. Some aren't even around anymore, but lots of continued support from industry as well. So we're going to be talking about the up and downs, and I thought this was a great comic to kind of sum up, the reality of how things go. We think, it's going to be this nice incline and slow, steady progress, but it's kind of like, yeah, okay. Back to where we started, I suppose, sometimes. All right, there we go. So novel crops. What defines a novel crop? Well, no, I didn't give it away. I'm looking at the wrong spot there. Okay. What defines a novel crop? Oh, yeah. Something with low acres, something really small acres, something new on the block. So something you probably haven't grown before, something with limited agronomy. So what are the crops that we're growing we don't have a lot of information about? What are crops where we might have some crazy pressures, might have some disease pressures, some insect pressures? We don't know how to deal with that yet. And then, kind of like, this airplane analogy, it takes a lot of things to pile up before you have, like the speaker before, if you have any trouble in that industry. In novel crops, one small thing can go wrong. It can derail the entire process. A lot of our staple crops that we have, there's a lot more resiliency built into those systems. You can screw up your seeding rate, date, depth, whatever, and it'll have a small impact on your overall bottom line, but that can make or break how things go with your novel crops. So like I said, limited acres, new to the area, agronomy lacking, pesticides and registered products lacking, and just a low margin for error overall. And that's important when we're selecting a new crop to grow. So I put this slide up here. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. The people ahead of me definitely are the trailblazers and the pioneers, but this is going to relate to the chart that I show you in a second here. So I'm way further along on this curve. So some of the people I talked about before, this guy here is Richard Rose. He's kind of the American version maybe of Jan Slasky for those of you that know him. And I put him up here because I stole his chart from the American hemp industry. And so this is a perfect illustration of the boom and bust of novel crops. And what happened was back in 2019, they had this U.S. Farm Bill come in. And up till then, they were kind of ramping up and really excited for production. I had a buddy come and visit me from the States, and he wanted to know everything he could possibly know about hemp, and he was so excited for this big situation. And 500,000 acres in 2019, that's when they had that farm bill. But 92% of it was for CBD. Unlike our industry here, where it started off as grain markets, built into fiber markets, we've kind of really done a good job. It was all CBD, and it just went bust really quick because they didn't have anything to support that. And so this is kind of the cycle we're going to see over and over again kind of play out. So this is one of those slides I got from Scott at WADO. This is just looking at all the different kinds of crops you can grow, and there's a lot on here. So just take a second, list off how many cereals, how many grasses, how many legumes, how many pulses, if you really start to think about it, there's a huge diversity of crops that you've probably tried and maybe even forgot about, hopefully forgotten about or wanted to forget about. And we can start to populate this list. And then what I did was I kind of highlighted the couple that we hadn't tried, and I was surprised by how many we had either tried or heard about or had other people who tried. So, I'm going to keep clicking here. There we go. So this einkorn, telf, teff, yeah. Mahuinin, this is kind of a very specific kind of grass. This barometric, not very many that I hadn't really heard of. And so when it comes to the adoption side, you will kind of see how far they can progress along these phases. And so these ones that I highlighted, these ones are the ones that just haven't gone anywhere. Either one person's tried them or nobody's tried them or whatever. And then again, on the vegetable side, I think that's kind of a whole different market and a whole different industry than we maybe have here. So, this slide is a lot going on, but I wanted to show it because this was just kind of all the things you could think of that could potentially challenge crop diversification. And in this term, I'm calling it novel crops. But I thought it would be easier to kind of take that and break it down into the stages where we can actually have some influence. So, we're going to have a look at that here. So this is the 5 stages of technology adoption, but I think it applies to novel crops. I think it's kind of the same stages. You have the innovators that come in, the people willing to try 10 acres of something, the visionaries who see kind of what could be happening. They start trying things out that their neighbors are doing. The pragmaticists, these are the people who are like, okay, this is an industry that's going to go somewhere. And then the conservatives and skeptics are kind of on the later side. So, this is a bell curve, but for the rest of my analogy, we're not going to think of it as a bell curve. We're going to kind of think of it as that, kind of scaling up. And once you get to the top there, you can't really kick back, but you can kind of let the other things take over in the industry and other folks kind of take the reins. So let's have a look here. So hurdle 1. This is our first step to overcome. You need the innovators. So that's why I had that slide of Jan and some other folks. And I think a lot of the people in this room are probably innovators in this regard. And so what are those requirements that they have? Well, you have to decide, is there any competition? Is there a niche? Is there actually a market? Is there a need? And what are the economics? What's the ROI potential? What's the risk going to be for you? And what is the displacement? So if you start growing something, something else has to give. You can't just add it into your rotation without something else being displaced. So we're going to look at some cool examples from the archives here. This first one's Artemisia. This is back in 2009. This study was funded. This was actually done by Sarah before we became Farming Smarter. This was, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So this was started off by and kind of ran by Paul Watson, Alberta Research Council, before it became Initech. Artemisinin is used to treat multi-drug resistant malaria, and it affects 1 million people a year. So they can synthesize, or they can take that, distill it down, get the oil content out for the artemisinin, okay, that's such a hard word to say. But there were some challenges. So this blew expectations out of the water. It was like 7 times the yield they expected. It grew 6 feet tall. The percentage, 20% oil content, was through the roof. But global demand's only 100,000 acres. So it's a small peanuts in a global supply chain, right? And they were looking back when this was 2009. It was $2.2 million then to build a processing facility in Taber. I mean, you can add a 1 to the left side or a 0 to the other. Is probably 10 to 20 million to build that same facility now. And so it just never really took off. Somebody else probably already had something in place, scaled up, and that was maybe the end of the story. Who knows? Maybe there'll be other compounds that this could work on, but for its intended purposes, the demand and the processing side it was never going to be. It was kind of a non-starter, I guess, but a really cool project overall, and 1 year before I started, I think. Another one they tried out in Wado, this is calendula. So this is like basically, it's called pot marigold. They're farming flowers essentially, and they can harvest it. It looks kind of just like miniature sunflower seeds. Same, different kind of purposes, but around 20% oil content. But they just found that there's all this extra material that came out the combine and they had to deal with in the processing facilities. Not really a market for it. It was all these little potentials, but no one really leading a charge for it. And then that oil extraction process, I guess they said they just about broke their processor trying to cold press this out to preserve the quality. And as soon as they got to that step, they're like, yeah, this is it's going to be a non-starter as well. So that brings us to our second phase. I guess our second hurdle, which would be sustaining those early adopters. So now we're trying to get to those visionaries, the people who are kind of like, okay, we have something here. What can we make a go of? And I think that's where Farming Smarter comes in. So we kind of help through these ups and downs. And a lot of the research we do focus on these early kind of innovative crops. And so now we're looking at things like, is the crop adapted to our region? What is the climate like? What is the varieties? Are they actually suitable varieties for what we're doing? Do we need a breeding program? What are some of the basic agronomy? Seeding rates, seeding dates, fertility, yield, and is it the same from other parts of the world as it is to what we need to grow? The water management, pests and pesticide management, and just the overall basics for growing the crop. So I've got some examples of where we've done some work here and where things have moved along a little further. So winter pulses. We've been involved in this quite a long time. And they haven't really gotten anywhere for a number of reasons, but they're a really still exciting crop and an innovative crop. And I pulled this stuff straight out of 2008. And all it's saying is that the lentils didn't do as well as the peas. Peas had good survivability. In our region, right around Lethbridge, the varieties that we had at the time, they really only survived in Lethbridge consistently. Maybe 1 or 2 years here and there in other parts, but it was really Lethbridge plus or minus 30K that we had yields. And then, we did some more work. We did some varieties. We did some herbicides, some seeding depth states, burn-off, some work with pea leaf weevil to see pea leaf weevil is a big problem at that time in spring peas, and a whole bunch of field scale trials as well. But it was just kind of lacking that overall investment from something more than, say a small organization. And so we didn't have any varieties and nothing really went anywhere. Winter barley, similar kind of story. So we were doing this back in 2009. There we go. And, we were getting 1,500 kgs per hectare to almost 2,000. I mean, not great yields for fall seeded barley. And we did a couple different varieties there, a couple different years. I think one year they were closer to 3,000 kgs per hectare. Well, this is where things get interesting, right? Because I talked about it, things go up and down. So welcome to 2021, and Trevor's program is working on some winter crop adaptability projects again. And folks like Western Ag, folks like Yield 10, there's a bunch of other groups working on this winter adaptability, working at new varieties. And so what are some of the differences that we're seeing? Well, the moisture use efficiency, we know there's a good news conservation story for winter wheat. We know with the climate change goals and cover cropping, where cover cropping has failed, there is potential for some of these winter crops to have a go at things. But what's obviously the apparent disadvantages? Fall seeding, it's tough, it screws up rotation, logistics, and there's just some overall, ups and downs at both sides. So this is us here. I got this video back from the archives, 2009. This is us harvesting camelina. So back then, we were looking at whether it was broadcast or seeded, spring versus fall dates, rates, depths, but it was really lacking some herbicide options, and it lacked any kind of processing facilities or centers. So nonetheless, we were kind of interested in it way back then. But like I said, didn't make a go of it then. So fast forward to 2021, we're kind of back on this up here. And so, we've got some new kind of inputs on breeding. So cold tolerant, drought tolerant, herbicide tolerant GMO strains. They're scaling up. Processors are putting investment in. seed productions, putting investment in, and then better contracts and MOUs with the companies and stuff themselves. So these are some of the things that I think it's taken to kind of bring the industries back up. And then we'll have to see whether or not we can cross into the next phase. This is just an example of some of those other fall varieties that that innovation team is working on. So, comparing in the kind of salmon color there, the fall crops versus the spring in the blue. So even with the fall crops getting up to that close to 4,000 kgs a hectare, our spring variety is still a little better on the barley. Camelina actually is the one that probably stands out there as one. Camelina and the wheat actually did really good for the fall seeding compared to the spring seeding. So like I said, maybe a potential good news story on some of the climate change and other things. This is another project that came from that kind of mid-2000s, late 2010 to 2016 range, was this mustard, carinata, kind of looking at, that canola industry did so well. What are some other things that could follow in the footsteps? So Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, Mustard 21, Agrizoma Biosciences, a lot of players came together, put a lot of resources into the breeding program. So we've seen in a lot of the novel crops that variety side has just been lacking. And so they put a lot of time and effort into the breeding program, worked on agronomy stuff. We did some miscellaneous trials to help out with that. This, like the carinata crop, for instance, are really focused on the jet biofuel. Half of it's used for that in the States. It's blended with conventional oils and used for jet fuel. But they had some troubles in kind of, I'd say, the North America or our kind of region. And I think it's just that displacement piece, the processing piece, and they ultimately packed up. Carinata is mostly focused in the US because of their jet fuel aviation industry, and mustard has tended to focus more on that condiment and specialty seeds kind of thing and less on the oil seeds. But at least the good news for something like mustard, other avenues and revenue streams to keep a crop in what they're doing. So really interesting things there. Maybe some other random things we could try. These are lupins. They've had some success growing them, obviously, in the Peace Country. They're drought tolerant, they're Phantomyces resistant, really high protein. I think they look beautiful, which every crop should. I think that should be like a requirement in registering them. It has to look pretty and colorful. But there's still problems. So obviously they lack that herbicides. They have problems with blister beetles or other diseases like anthracnose that can affect them, and inoculant can be an issue as well. So it's something, we've never actually tried this at Farming Smarter, but maybe one day we'll see. I think last one in this section is rice, and so it fascinated to see that they had tried this back in 2012. And so this was in Manitoba. These pictures are from Manitoba 2012, and actually we've been working on it for the last couple of years. So we did some different trials where we looked at transplanting, seed film, and direct seeding. And what was really interesting is he's kind of mimicking some of the techniques that they're using in other parts of the world. So this is what that looks like. So that transplanted, we had really good success, a little bit of shock from transplanting them and hand putting them into little rows. The seed film really didn't go anywhere. I think the plants there are probably wild oats that are actually peeking through that sticky thing we had there. It didn't work well for us. And then direct seeded, they weren't the best, but they were the most obvious choice is what farmers are going to want to do. Having to have a special piece of equipment can then shoot plugs down and all sorts of things was just, didn't see it working out really long term to get it up and coming here. So there's just a couple interesting charts from there. So on the three bars on the left there, the red and the blue and the green, that's kind of our plant stands the very first year. And then on the far right, that's our plant stands in 2023. So I think we certainly learned a lot between the first 2 years of doing this, improved up to about 100 plants per meter squared, that's what our target needs to be at to have some sort of production. I think I forgot to throw the final stage in here, but we're still struggling to get grains out of these. The other interesting thing, like I said, when it comes to varieties, so we have a number of different seeding dates here for rice, and they're all seeded at different dates, so you'd expect those lines to kind of be offset from one another. So this is basically just the plant heights week by week by week. And if they were growing at a steady rate per seeding date, all those lines would be staggered, but they're overlapping. And so like a lot of trees and other things, they're photoperiod sensitive. So we need the right lines here to be able to kind of adapt to our climate and just grow and say, hey, I've been in the ground for 10 days, I'm popping out, I'm growing. I've been growing for 40 days, I'm going to go into reproductive stage now. And that's something that's kind of lacking within the rice crops. So our third section here, it didn't show up. Third hurdle is building industry. So at this point, we've got some basics down. We know it's going to work here. We know we can grow it. So what do we need? This is where we need that regional processors. We need infrastructure. We need investment, commodity supports, reinvestment of checkoff dollars, specialty equipment, some provincial specialist breeders, all that kind of support network that comes with things. If that doesn't exist, it's going to be really hard to see something go somewhere. And maybe there's a place for small crops to say very, very small, and one farmer does it, and that's their little baby, like we've seen in other parts of the world. But to move it from a novel crop to something like maybe like faba beans, where it's becoming more and more widely adopted, you kind of need the rest of the support networks to be in there. There we go. So where have we seen some kind of successes like this? Well, I think quinoa is one that comes to mind. Quinoa is something I think that it kind of came out in about 10 years ago, really. So it's kind of at the earlier stages, but it's earlier compared to, say, canola or hemp or something like that. But it's moved far enough along that producers are starting to maybe give it a chance here. So just some interesting things when it comes to quinoa. Quinoa is more on the food crop, so all these grains are processed for the quinoa seeds and then used in food markets. So really important things to consider here. Yield is only one factor. You've got the consistency aspect, so how uniform things are. You've got harvestability, that's hugely important. The flavors, so the nuttiness, the tannins, the flavor profile, the shape of the seed, how it looks, like the visuals, the color. You can see two totally different varieties, two totally different pictures. It makes a difference. The smell, transportation, shelf life, processing. I'm sure there's a few others we could think of. So when it comes to something that's kind of novel, a lot of those other factors come into play and add to the picture there. So they've got a nice feel-good story here. Is Norquin, kind of our local group that processes out in Saskatchewan. But they're big on the water conservation. So one interesting thing with the quinoa crop is that it uses a lot less in processing than their kind of South American processing. And then the water usage. So in southern Alberta, we might be on average 6 to 7 inches of water a year. Quinoa only needs about 12, so it doesn't need a fully irrigated system. You don't need to hit it with 20 inches like a lot of our other specialty crops and some of the things Lewis might talk about. We can get away with 12 and a half inches and get a really good crop. And in fact, that's what we did for a number of years while we grew quinoa. And we're really happy with the results. The other interesting thing from their perspective is that they're kind of, unless you get lucky and find a bag of seed on the side of the road somewhere, I mean, you have to apply to be a grower, It's true story, yeah. And so, like I said, because novel crops have a high possibility of failure, they want to minimize that failure as much as a farmer might. So they want to make sure that you have all the right agronomics, the right cropping system, the right equipment, and all those things in place before they're going to sign you up to grow quinoa, essentially. So seed timing, this is an interesting one. So kind of just before that May long weekend, we're actually, one of the things we're doing, because we can only put Avidex down and we can only hit any flushing weeds with Glyoname. There's no residuals that we can use. We want that first flush to be germinated. It's usually just before May long, we've had a shot of rain, or if we're irrigating, we can put a little irrigation down, kill that first flush off and get seeding. Herbicides, somebody asked me earlier what quinoa is related to, so it's Chenopodium quinoa, and Chenopodium album is that lamb's quarters. And so because it's so closely related, it's just different on a species level. Most herbicides, broadleaf herbicides, are going to kill quinoa. For in-crops, we do have Assure, so we can spray most grassy weeds out. And then for pests, we're going to be spraying a number of times. So stem borer is a huge issue. This happens during stem elongation. A little weevil type thing will climb up into the stem, bore all the way through, and then it'll fall down. So you can actually split the stems lengthwise. You'll see those kind of tunnels that they dig within the stem and know that you have to spray. And then this goosefoot groundling moth also attacks during grain development. It's really important to get your grain yield to protect for that. So this is a quote. I forgot to mention, pulled some quotes out of our final study. So we've been working on this integrating novel crop study that was led by Jan Slasky from Initech. And so there's a couple quotes in here I just pulled out at a few points. Basically, I meant to highlight and bold a couple spots in there, but he's really saying that, because of the lack of herbicides and because of the risk of total crop failure, it was a really hard crop to grow for many parts. And unless you had that full agronomy package and you were really good on your production practices, you're more than likely going to have a failure growing it. So here's some shots. So this would be quinoa grown on a kind of cereal type stubble. This is what happens when I think we grew it on a flax. This is a flax stubble where they had just a ton of volunteers. They had bad harvest conditions the year before. Lots of volunteers. Canola is just about impossible. And then this looks like it's maybe wheat or barley barley kind of stubble. So lots and lots of volunteer problems. This wasn't our site in Lethbridge. Didn't look that bad, but it can be a huge issue. And so we had locations for this rotational study across Western Canada, I guess, but Lethbridge, Vegreville, up in the Peace Country, and then out in Saskatchewan as well. And which is crazy that the locations differed so much with respect. So in Vegreville, there was a huge effect of the crop rotation. So those pictures I just showed you, you can see how bad it was. Depending on the preceding crop, it made a huge difference on what happened the next year. In Lethbridge, to a lesser extent, but we were also very affected by our previous crops. They did find that the stuff up in the Peace Country and out in Saskatchewan didn't have that effect nearly as much. And so trying to figure out if that's maybe related to some of the weather, climate, and just overall growing differences that they have. But just so you know, when you talk about soil or crop rotations, we are still quite affected here in our Lethbridge area. The other thing is just the high number of volunteer plants. Like I said, if you had stuff that shelled canola and flax and hemp and other things, quinoa was not a good choice to go after that. Universally, we're looking at putting it on a cereal stubble for most of the time. So here's some shots of the quinoa. So this is stuff we harvested off a durum stubble. And you see, nice and clean that is. Maybe a little buckwheat or some other weed escapes that were in there. And then here's something we pulled off hemp stubble. So hardly even filled the bucket. And then when you get a close-up on that grain, it's just full of dockage, probably 30-40%, tons of other weed seeds and other things in there that we didn't quite get control on. So it just goes to show you how important that rotational aspect is for a novel crop like that.
I'll show you this plot. I don't want to. I really don't even want to try and harvest it, but you can see this is our quinoa on hemp.
A shot of how
Moving
that
on, if you're new to growing quinoa, your recommendations are going to be to grow it on a cereal. So this is quinoa on durum. Already I can see and feel, probably on camera, I'm not sure if it picks up, this is a lot taller. So we did some height measurements on all this as well. This quinoa is a lot thicker stand. Even the plants themselves are a lot more robust. So that's probably one of the benefits of not having it on its same crop. As well as the weed control, you can see there's a few sporadic kochias, but this looks really, really good in terms of quinoa fields. This is something that I didn't have recommended to me or to us when we were growing quinoa, but right now it looks like the winner to me. It's nice and tall. I could feel the crop growing as I drove by compared to everything else. The plants are just really robust and I think nice and uniform. I'm really happy with this, and this is our pea stubble.
There we go. So what's awesome about that was I predicted right. Our pulse crops were identified as the best preceding crops for most of both our staple and our novel prairie crops, actually. But specifically in Lethbridge, our dry bean, which is what I said in the video there, we had the best yields after dry bean for almost all of the crops that we grew after. And then both peas and faba beans at Vegreville and Falere and peas at Indian Head. So, pulse crops really did enhance yields for us. And in this case, I think also somehow helped with the weed control, but really cool to see that. So we're in this third phase still, right? So what do we need? This is all the commissions, right? So Alberta barley, canola, pulse, wheat. When you have a strong, stable commissions, it's really easy to put and reinvest back into those crops. Novel crops struggle with that, right? And so that's a challenge we're up against for some of the smaller. So some of the, hemp and sassafras, at least they have some sort of commission, some sort of support, or they go through some of these other clusters. But some of these really small ones have basically nothing to work off of. So then you've got the research partners. So CAP, ARDAR, this DFCC, that's the one that funds a lot of the smaller niche crops. Weston Foundation's more on that soil health, climate change type stuff, and then WGRF as well. So then the other side of that is the industry support. And so you look at the potato stuff that's come here. We've got a huge investment in a production plant here in Lethbridge. Pioneer and Corteva, I'll kind of touch on that in a little bit. Norquin, Manitoba Harvest, and then like Yield 10 and Agrozoma Sciences on the oilseed side. So let's get on to stage 4. This is what I call the wild cards. So, we've kind of made it up to the peak here, and this is kind of where you start cruising down the hill. Any number of things could go wrong. You've done all the hard work, climbing the mountain, whatever analogy you want to use, but any number of things could still go wrong. So you've got supply chains issues, support services. Can you get the skilled labor, and can you get it for a decent cost? Is it something that's really labor intensive, or is something you can mechanize? The lending insurance is such a wild card. I was talking with a few people earlier, it takes 4 or 5 years to get proper crop data for AFSC on a lot of these novel crops. So you're kind of growing it at your own risk for the first little while. And then transport issues. You've seen, even in established markets like canola and pulse crops, we've seen issues with transport and getting things out to market. So dryland grain corn, this is a project that we worked on 2015 to 2017. It's kind of a novel crop. I mean, corn is a staple. We all know how to do it, but in a dryland scenario, it kind of becomes novel again. And so up at the top there's maybe the first iteration of the Pioneer facility, and then big investment into doing this research and doing lots of work on corn. They really predicted that corn was just going to move west from Manitoba, Saskatchewan be the next big thing here, right? And we did some cool pioneering work to kind of get ahead of the curve here. So this first thing we looked at in dryland corn was narrow versus kind of normal seed rows. And so in our dryland scenario in southern Alberta, these 20-inch rows really did the trick. And this is where we got our maximum yield. And the yield curve kind of kept going up. So the higher seeding rate we could do, the better our yields. And this is the first time we basically got that monosem planter was for these corn type studies here. So then this second thing we looked at was the nitrogen response. So obviously it's really important to know what our end curve's going to look like. And this was a big shocker to all of us, because we know from the crazy yields in the States in irrigated acres, you got to pump the N on your corn. But in our dryland, we're only getting 80 bushels to 100 bushels an acre, and we found there wasn't a significant response. As long as we had 50 to 200 pounds total somewhere between all those years, it didn't make a difference overall. And I think we worked out as long as about 100 to 200 total that, if we had sufficient fertilizer, we didn't need to add any more, basically. It was a dryland scenario. And I should note, this 2015 to 2018 period, this was bad drought. And so it was a really good test, because we would have had 20 or 10 bushel canola crops in some of these years. So really significant that we got such high corn yields. And then the final thing, this is like I just mentioned with our other rotational stuff, is we looked at percent emergence based on either cultivated or no-till. So the conventional tills in the really light color there, and they're all basically 100% I think I'm just showing emergence. They're all basically 100% emergence. No difference. You cultivated it. It didn't make a difference. But where we were trying to direct seed in, we had some big impacts. And so obviously corn on corn didn't work. Corn on mustard had some trouble. Even corn on peas, which was a little bit surprising, and soybean and wheat, down in the mid-80s. And so a big difference. We've adapted that planter, and I think we're better at using it. And if we repeated this study, I think we'd see maybe a little better numbers from that no-till plots. If you build it, they will come. But like I said, this industry is just something that it hasn't taken off. And I'm still surprised. I'd still consider it if I was growing corn, but it is what it is. Another kind of novel / staple crop around here is the flax industry. You've got the golden flax becoming more and more popular now, the lightly colored. So this is something that's kind of got some stability from all the food side, but there is big opportunity on the fiber side. And this is something we kind of need to, I guess I better speed up, eh? I guess we kind of need the rest of the processing and things to follow suit. What, 10 minutes? Oh, okay. You sure? This is 40 minutes here. All right. I already mentioned the act of God and hail kind of stuff. Definitely challenges for novel crops. I want to get to the hemp here. Stage 5, or hurdle 5. That should say continuing supply. So this is where we need to reinvest in research, and we need to build that public support, and we need to basically build that good news story around whatever we're doing. And once we have that full picture, then I think that's where we're going to have the industry success. And if the general public is behind something, the chances of funders not funding it, governments not supporting it, that drops significantly, and it just helps sustain the industry more than anything else. So I'm going to talk about hemp a little bit. So this is a really great chart. This is one that came from Yan, and this is just looking at total Canadian production in hectares. So this is the area in hectares in production for grain, fiber, and CB, just everything that's going on. This is a really cool story because back in 1998 is where we have legalization. So we get a little blip here. Everybody's excited to grow hemp. But nothing really happens till about 2005. And 2005 is where we get some good investment by food processors. And so they're like, hey, we can scale up some production. But obviously what happens, we've built this opportunity. Everybody gets excited. We probably overproduce. And then it drops back down for another 5 or 6 years. So then we get some additional processing capacity. Things start to take off. 2013, South Korean, 4 minutes, okay. South Korean export markets open up. But then in 2015, South Korea starts buying from China. So they stop buying all of our excess. Legalization 2017, remember that chart from the States? Everybody is really excited for hemp legalization, probably overproduce again. And then this kind of cutoff here just kind of shows a little difference in how they report, but not a big deal for us right now. COVID-19, I guess I got to mention that, 1920 there. So what are we doing there in this time? Well, we're working on variety trials with the rest of the CHDA and Initech and province and everybody. We've got this hemp agronomy program, so that's with Initech and SARDA as well. This is our first iteration of the agronomy program. Then in 2018, we have a second hemp agronomy program. We do a little bit of stuff on minor use. And now we've got some new projects we're going to start on hemp retting and seed treatment. So really excited to kind of see the continual reinvestment there. This is just a shot of the variety trials. I'll probably just skip through this, but this is kind of the support we have for processing. So all these little factories in blue, these are processors in Alberta, and then the ones in orange, those are the ones that are proposed. And then there's also some in hemp production services in Saskatchewan, Manitoba Harvest, Tilray Foods in Manitoba, and some others being proposed, I think, on the reserve and a few other places as well. So we have some supports there to make things happen. So what are some of those pivotal things we had to figure out? Well, we were told to wait till May long for our seeding date, and one of our first studies we did showed that our best yields came in early May, 6 and 9 years. 3 and 9 years, kind of that May long. And even though we were told, hey, it doesn't matter if you seed in June, in Lethbridge we never had good yields from that. And so we learned right away that we could seed earlier, get way better hemp crops. And that was kind of a big thing for a lot of the people who had been doing it for a while and just following the recommendations. The other huge thing we learned was just how important this variety selection is. And you can see how much that tonnage changes. I wouldn't expect to see that on a wheat or barley chart or even a canola chart or something. Those variety trials, you might have 100%, 103%, 97%. I mean, this hemp is like, if you had to pick a check there, you'd have some that were shooting up 500% compared to others. And so the variety selection is very critical for end use. Are you growing it for feed, for food, for fiber, for fractions? And then the last side, just like we did in the corn, is the yield response curve. And we learned we need about 200 kgs per hectare total nitrogen to grow our hemp crops under irrigation. And once we hit that, we're good. And it was kind of regardless of variety. They all responded maybe differently in terms of biomass. The majority of our nitrogen went into biomass production. Here's just a quick shot of some seeding date trials. So this is a UAV that I put together. April 15th, we couldn't even get it seeded that year, which is atypical for us. And I think this picture was taken about June 21st. I took all of these, or July, sorry. And you can see, just the difference in that 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. And so it's pretty obvious how that seeding date affect us. This was just a 1 year site year data, so don't expect to grow 6,000 kg per hectare hemp. But I think that's just kind of illustrating my point there. Also did some work on kind of the fertigation, mimicking fertigation, and looking at some dribble banding. And big take home we found was that the check was significantly lower, sure, but the timings didn't really make a big difference. As long as we were getting that fertilizer to the crops, we were pretty happy. Like I said, ups and downs. This is one of our downs on hemp. Just September 30th, who counts on a snowfall into September? But it happened, and is what it is. So we got a couple new projects that we're going to be working on. One's going to be working on hemp retting, so we'll be doing some fall augmented winter retting, seeing how that affects the fiber quality. This is a big deal for all those, like I said, those blue plants all across the province here. And kind of looking at different techniques for different areas and different regions. And we'll also be looking at some different seed treatments. And so looking at whether or not some of these fungicide type seed treatments can improve the vigor, how that is affected on some other parameters as well. I'm basically going to wrap it up with this kind of canola Canadian success story. I mean, I was almost started with this, but I probably you could do 10 presentations on the canola industry in Canada, right? But basically, big investment in the 50s and 60s, lots of work on the breeding, lots of works on agronomics. I spent a lot of years when I first started going to Cano Lab and some of those other commission and industry events, big investment for farmers. And just overall, this was, kind of the little darling child of Canada. And a lot of these other industries, if you look, they're kind of trying to model that. They're trying to integrate the herbicide systems. They're trying to integrate the whole downstream processes. It's a little tongue twister here for you. In conclusion, will Canada cannibalize the cannabis industry, or will Canada take the candid canoe across the canyon for another canola? I guess I forgot there was that little chasm in that chart. I forgot about that. That's fine. There you go. And we'll leave you with some inspirational things, because we're talking about novel crop, some inspiration for everybody. There's always ups and downs, but no matter how successful. And there's potential for things to go wrong at any number of these phases. It doesn't take a whole lot. You might have this plan, but the reality is entirely different. So, any questions? That'd be awesome. I think I'm done.
Any questions for Mike? We have time for one. Yeah, we got one on the side over there.
What is hemp retting?
Oh, Good point. Hemp retting is basically leaving the straw out for it to break down. And so within that project, they actually identified, at Inotech, they identified a bunch of fungi and bacteria that are responsible for breaking down the fibers and allowing us to process them, essentially. And so there's a number of different organisms that are responsible for that, and we're looking at different techniques for doing it. So for example, in lots of places, it's too dry in the fall, and so that's why for us, we're looking at irrigating over top to wet it down, kind of get that microbial activity going. Also looking at the biological supplements to speed that up, and then whether or not we should even maybe be leaving it over the winter just to see how effective it is.